more U.S. products have a chance to be exempted from China's countermeasure tariffs a week after the Phase 1 trade deal took effect. On the flip side, the lingering tough U.S. policies on China are not doing either side a favor. Many believe that, from Chinese perspective, that presents a big challenge for the National Committee on U.S. China Relations, whose goal is to build constructive and durable relationships between the two nations. What's the best way forward? We invite now the NCUSR President, or National Committee on U.S. China Relations President Stephen Orlins, who joined us in the New York City. Welcome to our program, Steve.
Good to be on your program. Sorry I can't see you.
I can see you clearly, and thank you for joining us on the early morning in New York. Let me ask you, by starting from the recent donation provided by the private sector of the U.S., your organization was one of those organizers of this campaign. Tell us more about that. At least the 2 million masks and many other different kinds of medical supplies too. How did that happen?
What's so striking about since the onset of the coronavirus in China is the outpouring of support from the American people and the American business community. Literally, the phone has been ringing off the hook. How can we help? How can we help the Chinese people? And what it reminds me is that the bonds between the Chinese people and the American people remain extremely strong. No matter what is going on between the two governments, the bonds between the people of China and the people of the United States remains so strong. And this outpouring of support, of money, of supplies, of free airplanes, and of many other things just show how strong the feelings are in the United States. It's not only the Chinese-American community. Obviously, the Chinese-American community is being very supportive, but these are regular Caucasian Americans who are being supportive.
Yeah, but some here in China wonder whether it's big in words, small in actions, Steve.
Well, these are real actions. Goods are really being shipped. So it's important to look at that. It's important that these shipments, obviously they're not going to be huge in terms of China's entire need, but the symbolic importance of the American people standing with the Chinese people at this time of crisis is what should be emphasized, and it's what should be emphasized by the Chinese media and the American media. While the governments continue to have problems, I continue to hope that this people-to-people relationship will remain the ballast of the U.S. China relationship. You know, I'm reminded, I think on your program, in fact, this past autumn, you know, people always say, how can you remain in the face of all of these, you ask me, in the face of all these problems in U.S. China relations, how can you remain an optimist? And I point to 4 issues that I think will draw the people of China and the people of the United States together. I point to climate change. We need to cooperate on climate change to defeat this threat, this existential threat to the world. Economic crisis. If we have a repeat of 2008, we need the United States and China to work together. Terrorism, we need to work together. And the 4th thing I pointed out was pandemic. That if we have a pandemic, the people on each side are going to know we need to cooperate. Now, the results so far have been okay, not great. I think some comments by, Secretary Ross were, I think, not well thought out. I think the Chinese government should have allowed American experts immediately into China. Finally, it happened this past Friday. It should have happened 3 or 4 weeks ago. So the cooperation is okay, but it really should be a symbol to the peoples of both countries that we need to cooperate to confront these global issues.
I see. Just a footnote for you, Mr. Orlins. The Chinese side has been inviting the WHO team, which include experts coming from various countries. And as far as I know, there are American experts coming from 2 American entities that are in this expert team, just to report to you about that. Having said
Well,
that, though,
I was told by the U.S. government not till this past Friday did that occur. So it was quite some time before that happened. And transparency, trust, global trust is really critical. And it's important that we have transparency, accuracy, and we have exactly what you said, a multinational team in China to work with China's CDC, to work with the Chinese health authorities, to make sure the whole world understands what's going on.
Right. The other thing that needs to be mentioned is many here wonder why, at a time of a big crisis at home here in China, this time with the COVID-19 outbreak, the whole nation has been working so hard to fight this battle. The U.S., however, some point out, Mr. Orlins, on the other hand, particularly from the government side, have been doing one after another gesture that's not necessarily demonstrating the friendship of the U.S. side toward China, not even mention the humanitarian phase of the United States to another country. For example, right over the past few days, there has been scrapping of the status of a developing country about China. Well, you could argue whether that should be further discussed. Meanwhile, there has been naming Chinese media organizations as the so-called government entities, which is likely to put a lot of restrictions on Chinese media outlets in the U.S. Meanwhile, there has been indictment against Huawei, an issue that we have been discussing for a lot of occasions. I know, of course, very well that you do not represent the U.S. government, but some of the messages coming out of Washington, particularly from this administration, is also being read here by many Chinese in a very different light. Mr. Orlins, my question is not to let you to explain what the government policies are, but rather to let you help us to understand how can the civil society like yours, your organization, for example, and also your sister organizations and people who have been working on this relationship for so long, be able to carry on under the current circumstances, Mr. Orlins?
Well, I think the current circumstances make the role of the National Committee on U.S. China Relations as crucial as it's been in our 50-plus year history. That it's really important that we educate, and educate. We educate the American people, we educate the Chinese people, we educate American media, we educate Chinese media, we talk to the Chinese government, and we talk to the U.S. government. Obviously, these mixed messages that are being conveyed from the U.S. government suggest a divided opinion within the U.S. government as to what the policy should be. We saw President Trump tweet rather strongly that America, you must be able, and he meant Chinese companies, must be able to do business with the United States. So the previous day there had been discussion of whether GE jet engines could be sold to a Chinese company. And President Trump said, of course they should. So he kind of overruled those in the United States government who were looking to further restrict the kind of business that we can do with China. So the views in the U.S. government, the views in the think tank community, the views in the media, the views in the people are quite mixed. So it's important that the National Committee and others who kind of believe in constructive relations continue to educate. Where necessary, we criticize the U.S. government. Where necessary, we criticize the Chinese government. We must be an honest broker in this environment.
Having said that, though, we have seen the rise of xenophobia and racial profiling in some of the societies about China, Chinese people, or ethnic Chinese in those societies. Now, there are also cases inside the United States. I wouldn't mention here, not enough time, one by one on air now. But Mr. Orlins, you've been working on this relationship. You've been fighting against this kind of xenophobia, racial profiling for 4 and 5 decades. How much does it hurt you, I guess, in a way, that after 50 years of effort from the very beginning of the relationship, but diplomatic relationship, I'm saying, not to even mention the long time people-to-people relationship, that things like this still come back and haunt us all the time?
I think, as I said in last time I was on your program that in this environment, I'm often reminded of Martin Luther King's, in his final speech, he said, "When it's darkest, I can see the stars." So when I see these actions by the U.S. government that are solely based upon the ethnicity of an individual, whether it's a black person, a brown person, a Chinese person, I obviously will fight with everything I have left to oppose that. However, there are examples when there are Chinese in the United States who have violated U.S. law, and those prosecutions are well-founded. So the racial approach is obviously wrong, but when there is a law violation, it's incumbent upon the U.S. Department of Justice and others.
I'm not talking about those cases. I'm talking about the xenophobia and racial profiling cases over the past few weeks when the epidemic broke out here in China. It's a time that everybody showed the humanitarian face, but not the xenophobia and racial profiling. I'm talking about these cases. Mr. Orlins, you know me very well. This is exactly what I meant.
You're seeing an outpouring of support for the Chinese people, from the American people, from the American business community. That, the Huawei indictment, I think the Department of Justice viewed that in its own silo. It doesn't see that as related to the coronavirus. If I were the Attorney General, would I have sought to make to expand that indictment last Friday? No, I wouldn't. I would be much more sensitive to it. But the U.S. government, sometimes like the Chinese government, each cabinet
I'm not talking about the government even, Mr. Orlins. I'm not even talking about the government. I'm talking about, for example, so-called sick man of Asia. That kind of title is being in some of the publications by the American media. I'm not saying one story will represent the whole picture of the American media, but certainly that shows the lack of sensitivity and lack even of the humanitarian face of certain people in your country. I'm not saying you're representing them. I'm not saying you should explain to us about them because you're not them. I'm just saying, for people like you, what does it take for you now to work on your side to try to promote this relationship when you have seen now more dark sides of this and ever more of it coming at a time of a crisis? This is my question, Mr. Orlins.
But when there is, in the United States, when there is an action which is views as racist, the government cracked down. I mean, there was the New York Taxi and Limousine Commission. There seemed to be some evidence that taxi drivers weren't picking up Chinese because they were afraid they had the coronavirus. That's ridiculous. So what happened is the Taxi and Limousine Commission cracked down and said, if this happens, you must report it. There's a number, 311. You dial that and you report that a taxi driver has refused to pick you up because you're Asian. So what happens is when there is this racism that sometimes pops up, the people, the local governments, the state governments, they stand up against it. They're established institutions in the United States that oppose that kind of activity, and it remains the case. It's really the exception. Obviously, there is history in the United States that can be deeply disturbing. So when it rears its ugly head, people speak out. We certainly speak out. The Committee of 100 speaks out. Other institutions that are devoted to kind of constructive U.S. China relations and the protection of Asian Americans in the United States speak out.
Okay.
So there are institutions that speak out. It doesn't mean we step back. It means we actually step forward and we're more vigorous in protecting the rights of Chinese Americans.
Before we go, we have less than a minute. You have always been quoting Chairman Mao in a way when you are talking to your Chinese friends about at difficult times, courage is what we need. Now, where do you seek your courage? And how does your interactions with your Chinese counterparts in a way be able to enrich your sources of courage? I hope, Mr. Orlins.
Well, clearly, my friends are mostly in voluntary quarantine throughout China. I'm talking to them daily on WeChat. My heart goes out to all of my friends throughout China, from Shenzhen in the south up to Harbin in the north, from Sanya to Chengdu. It's friends all over. And my heart, every morning I get up and they're literally hundreds of WeChats I've got with friends talking about what their lives are like these days. And what it does, it just inspires me to work harder for constructive U.S. China relations, to when there are inaccuracies in the United States to talk about it.
Thank you so much, Mr. Orlins. I know you have a lot to share with us. We hope we'll have another opportunity to talk to one another on some of the specific improvement, I hope, that we can try to strike for.
Next time in person.
Hopefully. Thank you so much, sir. With the travel ban, we hope it will be lifted very soon. Thank you so much.
Hope it's lifted very soon, and I look forward to seeing you.
Yes. Yeah. Stephen Orlins, President of the National Committee on U.S. China Relations. Really appreciate that, your time, particularly out of your very busy schedule. Bye for now.